Everyone says the truth always comes to light. But that's a lie. Some secrets are buried so deep that only those who dare to dig will ever find them. That night, when the air in St. Mary Mead carried nothing but moonlight and unease, someone made a decision that could change everything. But there was one problem. Even the one making the decision didn't know who the real prey was. And when Miss Marple first noticed the one small detail that had escaped everyone else's eyes, that was when the story truly began. The evening air was thick with the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke, carrying whispers of an autumn that had begun to sink its teeth into the quiet village of Ravenshade. The gas lamps flickered uncertainly along the cobbled streets, their glow casting restless, shifting shadows that seemed almost alive. Somewhere in the distance a dog howled, a long mournful sound that sent a shiver through the spine of the night. The streets, though never lively at this hour, felt especially deserted tonight, as if the village itself was holding its breath. In the heart of the village, nestled between ancient bookshops and a jeweller's store long past its prime, lay the Blackthorn Tea Room, a place of muted conversations and secrets traded over delicate china. It was the kind of establishment where the past clung stubbornly to the present, where the scent of aged wood and dried lavender lingered in the air. Tonight, however, an unfamiliar tension coiled in its corners. The low hum of conversation was absent, and even the fire in the hearth burned lower than usual, casting flickering shadows against the floral wallpaper. Evelyn Harrow sat at her usual table by the window, her gloved fingers resting lightly against a porcelain cup that had long since lost its warmth. Her reflection in the glass was distorted by the mist curling along the pane, a ghostly twin watching her with unreadable eyes. She was waiting. The air hummed with a quiet tension, punctuated only by the soft clink of silverware and the occasional murmur from the only other patron, a man partially obscured by the dim light, his face hidden behind a crisp newspaper. He had been there when she arrived, yet had not turned a page in several minutes. The bell above the door jingled, and a figure entered, his presence cutting through the room's warmth like the edge of a knife. Tall, lean, draped in an overcoat that had seen better days, he moved with deliberate ease. His boots barely made a sound against the worn wooden floor, but the weight of his presence was undeniable. His eyes, sharp and knowing, swept the room before settling on her. Without hesitation, he slid into the chair across from her, his movements careful, deliberate. "You chose a good place, Miss Harrow," he murmured, his voice low, careful, public but quiet. She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You have something for me, Mr. Calloway." He studied her for a moment, then reached into his coat pocket, producing a folded slip of paper, its edges yellowed with age. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before placing it on the table between them. The break-in at the Langley estate, it was never about the paintings. Evelyn took the paper, unfolding it with the same care one might reserve for an unexploded device. Her gaze flickered over the faded ink, the ledger markings, the names. A transaction dated October 2nd, 1901, a payment made from one name to another. Her breath slowed. "These names," she murmured. "Langley and Cresswell." Calloway nodded, his expression grim. "Business partners once, then one vanished, the other became untouchable." Evelyn's pulse quickened. She had suspected as much, but the confirmation was more unsettling than she had anticipated. The Langley estate had always been shrouded in whispers, old money, older secrets, and now someone was sifting through its past, looking for something that had been buried for over a century. "And now someone is looking for this," she mused, folding the paper neatly before slipping it into her handbag. Calloway hesitated, then leaned forward. "People who ask too many questions about this don't tend to stay around long." A flicker of something unreadable passed through Evelyn's eyes. "Then I suppose," she murmured, "it's a good thing I've never been one to leave questions unanswered." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes, a restless force pressing against the fragile walls of the tea room. Calloway studied her for a long moment before tipping his hat in a wordless farewell. Then, just as swiftly as he had arrived, he was gone. Evelyn remained, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup, her mind already racing through the implications of what she had just uncovered. The pieces were moving, and somewhere in the shadows of Ravenshade, someone was watching. The moonlit landscape of Ravenshade always felt like a place steeped in old secrets, like a book where every shadow concealed an untold story. Narrow alleyways, ivy creeping over the walls of ancient mansions, and those teakwood shops untouched by time, all of it wove an air of deep mystery. Evelyn Hathaway traced the rim of her teacup with her finger, her mind drifting elsewhere, caught in a scene that had yet to fully reveal itself. Every new detail Gerald Finch had provided was forming a pattern, like dust swirling in the wind, unseen to most, yet unmistakably there for those who knew how to look. Before her lay a collection of old photographs she had examined from every possible angle, yet one image now sparked a new question. Reginald Hathaway, her father, a man of wealth and influence whose power had once reached into every corner of life, only to meet an end as tragic as it was suspicious. And in the corner of the frame, another face, Godfrey Lansing. His eyes, sharp and calculating, held a glimmer of something more. His smile was so faint that only a discerning observer would notice. He was always the man watching from a distance, never fooling himself, always ensuring he remained exactly where he needed to be. Evelyn turned the photograph over, searching for some unseen detail she might have missed. Then there were the old bank records, the financial figures arranged in a way that spoke of something more than mere misfortune. Reginald's downfall had not been an accident, it had been an orchestrated collapse, where the seemingly insignificant details were, in fact, the most crucial. And now something from the past refused to let go. The burglary at Evelyn's home had not been a simple robbery. Nothing had been disturbed, except for one thing. A small wooden seal once attached to one of her father's letters had vanished, and stranger still, the intruder had left behind a mark, not as a thief but as someone delivering a message. This was not the work of an ordinary criminal, this was someone entangled in the past, someone determined to unearth long-buried secrets. Evelyn picked up another old letter, her gaze narrowing at a single line scrawled across its faded paper. If you wait too long, the choices will no longer be yours. At first it had seemed like nothing more than an idle warning, but now as the pieces began to fit together, it felt like part of something far more intricate. This was no longer just about Reginald or a bygone scandal, it was a cycle, one that never truly ended, only new players stepped in, and now Evelyn had become part of the game. Outside, the moonlight cast a pale glow over the empty streets, the cobblestones gleaming under the cold stillness of the night. But near the edge of her home, a shadow lingered. She was no longer chasing a mystery, the mystery had found her. Beneath a tangle of discarded papers in the dim alleyway, something metallic caught the faint light, its glint too deliberate to belong to mere refuse. Evelyn Hathaway knelt, carefully brushing away the debris before lifting it between her fingers, a small weighty token, cool and solid against her palm. It was strikingly similar to the one left at Evander Archer's ransacked study, yet not identical. As she tilted it towards the dying light, the engraving became clear, a raven, but this time encircled by a laurel wreath, and beneath it, the same Latin inscription, vigilant. A slow breath escaped her lips. This was no coincidence, no careless trinket dropped in haste. It was deliberate, an echo of something greater. A pattern was forming, a message woven beneath the fabric of the ordinary, not a warning. A summons. Somewhere beneath the surface of this quiet village, a hidden force was at play, an entity with roots deeper than anyone dared to acknowledge, a secret society moving in the shadows, unseen yet omnipresent. The mere thought might have seemed absurd to a casual observer, but Evelyn had already peeled back enough layers of deception to know that the outlandish was often merely the undiscovered truth. She slipped the token into her coat pocket, her mind racing. If Archer's burglary had seemed like a crime of desperation, it was now clear that it was anything but. It was not an isolated incident, but a carefully placed move in a game that stretched far beyond one person's misfortune. Someone had left this here, placed precisely where only the right eyes would find it. The significance was undeniable. A system, a hierarchy, a whisper threading through the darkened corners of the village like an unseen current. But was it a force of justice? Or was it something else, something colder, something built on control? Either way, Evelyn knew one thing with certainty: she had just stepped beyond the threshold of understanding, and once inside, there was no stepping back. The Fox and Hound was the kind of establishment that had existed in every town for centuries, a place of heavy oak beams, thick with the scent of tobacco, ale, and hushed conversations. By day, it belonged to weary farmers and tradesmen seeking a brief respite. By night, it transformed into something else entirely. The flickering heartlight cast long shadows across the worn wooden floors, and the murmured exchanges between patrons took on an air of quiet urgency. Deals were made here. Secrets were traded, guarded behind unreadable expressions and wary glances. When a stranger walked in, conversations slowed, measured eyes drifting toward the newcomer before settling back into well-practiced indifference. Evelyn Hathaway was no regular visitor to such places, but experience had taught her that truth rarely presented itself in well-lit studies or polished parlors. It hid in corners like this, wrapped in the guise of small talk and silence, wrapped in a modest coat and a hat suited for an evening stroll rather than an investigation. She pushed open the heavy wooden door. The warmth inside was almost suffocating, thick with the mingling scents of damp wool and burning logs. The fire cracked, throwing restless shadows over the faces of those gathered. Most were men clustered in tight groups, their voices low but never entirely casual. She moved with quiet ease, choosing a table near the back, somewhere she could observe without inviting curiosity. A young barmaid, barely 20, approached hesitantly, amusement flickering in her eyes as she took in the elderly woman seated alone. "Evening, madam," she said, voice tinged with local dialect. "Bit late for tea, I'd wager." Evelyn offered a pleasant smile. "A sherry, if you please." "A small one." The girl nodded knowingly and disappeared into the dim haze. As Evelyn waited, she allowed her gaze to wander, not with overt scrutiny, but with the unassuming air of an older woman indulging in idle curiosity. Near the hearth, 3 men sat hunched over their drinks. Their attire was unremarkable: thick coats, flat caps, the kind worn by those accustomed to working with their hands. But their posture told another story. The way they leaned in, the way their voices never rose above a murmur, the occasional dart of their eyes toward the entrance, it all suggested something beyond casual drinking. She took a measured sip of her sherry, tilting her head just slightly, tuning into the rhythm of their conversation without drawing attention to herself. "Gone too far this time," one of them muttered, voice laced with quiet tension. "Mark my words." A second man grunted. "Doesn't matter what he thinks. There are rules, and he's broken them." A third voice, rougher, edged with something unreadable. "That don't mean we do anything stupid. We wait." A pause. The weight of unspoken knowledge settled thick in the air. Then the first man again, his voice dropping even lower, nearly swallowed by the fire's crackling. "Ain't no waiting with a man like that. If she talks, it's all undone." Evelyn's expression did not change, but the words rooted themselves in her mind. A she who might talk. A he who inspired fear, and then Roland Verger's got eyes everywhere. Her fingers tightened ever so slightly around the stem of her glass. There it was. The name. A shadow given form. And Evelyn Hathaway, it seemed, was standing directly in its path. The lantern's glow flickered against the damp cobblestones as Eleanor Graves stepped cautiously through the shadowed alley, her pulse steady but alert. The city, cloaked in midnight's hush, seemed to breathe with unseen eyes, its silence broken only by the distant chime of a clock tower marking the hour. In her gloved hand, She clutched a folded note. 4 words scrawled in ink too deliberate to be mere coincidence. He watches the unknowing. The paper had been slipped beneath her door just before twilight, its presence as unsettling as the absence of a sender. She had seen messages like this before, subtle warnings wrapped in cryptic intent, yet this one carried an air of finality she could not ignore. Turning a corner, she reached her destination, a forgotten bookshop, its windows clouded with dust, its sign worn by time. A single candle burned within, its frail glow barely piercing the gloom beyond the glass. As she stepped inside, the scent of aged parchment and candle wax filled her senses. The air felt thick, almost stagnant, as if the place had been waiting in silence for too long. Behind the counter, an old man barely lifted his gaze, his fingers trailing over a ledger with the absent-minded precision of someone who knew more than he would ever say. Eleanor placed the note on the wooden surface between them, its weight insignificant yet pressing. "Who sent this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The old man's lips tightened, his knuckles whitening as he folded the paper and tucked it into his vest pocket. His hesitation was telling. "It was never meant for you," he muttered, his voice carrying the weary resignation of someone who had seen too many unanswered questions. Before she could press him further, a noise from the back of the shop, a soft creak, the unmistakable sound of a door being unlatched. Eleanor turned sharply, but the room remained unchanged, save for the flickering candlelight stretching uneasy shadows across the walls. The old man straightened ever so slightly, his expression unreadable. "Leave it alone," he murmured. "You don't want to see what's behind that door." But curiosity had always been Eleanor's greatest curse. Taking a slow step toward the darkness beyond, she felt a shift in the air, an almost imperceptible breath of something unseen, moving in response to her presence. A trick of the mind, perhaps, or something far worse. Her fingers brushed against the edge of the counter as she steadied herself, her pulse quickening with the sudden unshakable sensation that she was no longer alone. Outside, the city remained still, but now she felt it, an unseen presence lurking just beyond her sight, watching, waiting. The words on the note echoed in her mind. "He watches the unknowing." This was no idle warning. This was a challenge, and whoever he was, he had just made his first move. The envelope lay before Eleanor Graves, its pristine white surface betraying no hint of its origin. The absence of a postage stamp, the precise alignment atop her morning letters, these details spoke volumes. With measured calm, she unsealed it, smoothing the single sheet within. 4 words met her gaze, written in a hand too deliberate to be coincidence. "The past is watching you." Below the message, a symbol, an ink-black raven encircled by thorns. The breath she released was slow, steady, but within, her thoughts were already whirring. A warning? Certainly. A command? Perhaps. But above all, it was a revelation. Someone out there knew she was looking, and rather than deter her, they had only sharpened her resolve. Folding the note carefully, she set it aside and reached for her journal. Every name, every whisper, every lingering shadow of a past too tangled to be coincidence, she had tracked them all. And now, the past had begun tracking her in return. That evening, the annual Thornbridge Gala unfolded within the opulent halls of Blackwood Manor. A grand affair of gloved hands and veiled intentions, where chandeliers dripped crystal light upon whispered dealings. A place where reputations were polished like silver and secrets passed between champagne glasses. Eleanor moved with practiced grace, her gown of midnight blue lending her an air of quiet elegance. She was no stranger to such gatherings, where the wealthiest and most powerful cloaked their misdeeds in the scent of expensive perfume. But tonight her attention was fixed on one figure alone. Across the ballroom, among the aristocrats and diplomats, stood a man she had not seen in over a decade, a man she had once trusted, and later hunted, Victor Alden. His face, though softened by age, still bore the same calculating charm. His posture was carefully measured, but his gaze flickered too often toward the exits. He was a man accustomed to control, yet now, he seemed uncertain of his footing. That alone was enough to tell Eleanor she had arrived at the heart of something far greater than she had anticipated. She did not approach at once. Instead, she observed, his laughter easy yet hollow, the way his fingers tightened around his glass when certain names were uttered. The momentary flicker of recognition when he thought no one was watching. Then, as if drawn by instinct, his eyes found hers. A fraction of a second, enough for his expression to shift, for something unguarded to surface before vanishing beneath the carefully placed mask of charm. He smiled, slow and a silent acknowledgement. The game had begun. Later, beneath the moonlit terrace, away from the revelry, Eleanor waited. The air carried the faint scent of rain, the distant hum of carriages beyond the estate walls. She did not have to wait long. "You always did have a habit of appearing where you shouldn't," came a voice from the shadows, smooth, amused, but edged with something unreadable. She turned slowly, finding Victor stepping forward, his hands in his pockets, his stance deceptively relaxed. Up close, she saw it. The tension coiled beneath his practiced ease, the careful way he measured her reaction. "And yet," she replied, "here you are as well." A beat of silence, a shift in the night air. He exhaled, glancing toward the manor as if weighing his next words. "You should leave this alone, Eleanor," he murmured. "Some things are meant to remain buried," but she merely smiled, ever so slightly. "Then why are you still digging?" His silence was answer enough. Somewhere in the distance, the chime of a clock tower marked the passing hour. The past was no longer content to remain a memory. It had returned, summoned by unseen hands, and Eleanor Graves was ready to follow wherever it led. The moon cast pale silver light over the garden's dew-laden grass, shadows stretching long between the hedgerows. Eleanor Graves stood by the marble fountain, her fingers tracing the cool stone edge as she listened to the rhythmic trickling of water. The air carried the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. She did not turn at the sound of approaching footsteps. She had been expecting him. "You've been asking questions," came the voice, smooth as ever, yet laced with something unreadable. "I have always asked questions," Eleanor replied lightly, her gaze still fixed on the distant treetops. "The trouble I find is that people dislike answering them." A quiet chuckle, dry, devoid of humor. "You always did see more than you ought." She finally turned, her eyes sharp and unrelenting. "That, my dear Victor, is precisely why we are standing here now." The mask of easy charm he wore slipped, just for a moment, revealing something closer to exhaustion. A pause, then in a voice quieter than before, he said, "Whatever you think this is, you may not want to know the truth." Eleanor held his gaze, unshaken. "On the contrary," she murmured, "I very much do." Victor exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw, tension flickering behind his composed exterior. "There are things at play here, Eleanor. Things you should leave alone." "How very mysterious," she mused. "I assume you are referring to the name Roland Vassar." His reaction was infinitesimal, a fraction of hesitation, a tightening at the corner of his mouth, but she saw it. "I see," she murmured. "I cannot help you," he said at last, though the words sounded more like a confession than a refusal. Eleanor studied him, reading the unease in his stance, the weight of an unspoken burden. "Then tell me, Victor, why were you at Eleanor Blackwood's estate the night she disappeared?" Silence, the kind that stretched heavy with implication. His lips parted slightly, but no words came. "I would rather like an answer," she pressed. A slow breath then, "At last the truth, or at least a sliver of it." "I was there because I had to be." "Had to be," she echoed, tilting her head. "There are people one does not refuse." The words carried a quiet finality. Eleanor absorbed them, nodding slightly. "And yet," she said softly, "here you are warning me." His lips curved into something resembling a smile, though it did not reach his eyes. Old habits. She considered him for a moment longer, then said, "You are not beyond redemption, Victor." A flicker of something, guilt, regret, fear, before he looked away. Then without another word, he turned, retreating into the darkness. She watched as he vanished into the night, the faint echo of his footsteps lost beneath the whisper of the wind. Inside her study, the fire had burned low, casting only the faintest glow upon the lace curtains. The house was silent save for the steady tick of the grandfather clock. Eleanor stood at her desk, fingers skimming over a collection of notes, sketches, newspaper clippings. The weight of the evening pressed upon her, a feeling she rarely entertained. Objectivity had always been her strength, and yet tonight she found herself wavering. Victor Alden, a name once belonging to a friend, a man she had once trusted, and now a name tangled within something far darker. She smoothed the edge of a folded note beneath her fingers. "Let sleeping dogs lie. The past is not yours to unearth." A warning, a threat. And with Victor's reappearance, a puzzle growing ever more tangled, she turned toward the fireplace, arms folded, mind racing. There are people one does not refuse. She had seen something in him tonight, hesitation, regret, a man caught in a web he could not escape. And yet he had not confessed. That she knew was telling in itself. Secrets rarely belong to just one person. Was he truly complicit, or merely another pawn in a far greater game? She flipped open her notebook, eyes scanning the careful, methodical entries. If the past had returned to be unearthed, then she had no intention of leaving the truth buried. Whatever game was being played, she had already made her move, and she had no doubt someone somewhere was preparing to strike first. A cold wind stirred the treetops as Eleanor Whitmore sat at the edge of her desk, the candlelight flickering against the delicate lace of her curtains. The clues were unraveling, each one a thin strand connecting to something deeper, something darker. The unsigned letter found in Lydia Havisham's study, the missing financial records linking Alistair Wakefield to the vanishing funds of the Whitmore Trust, and now the whispered name that had surfaced once again, Edric Vane. A name too many feared, a name that carried weight in places Eleanor could not yet reach. And then there was Victor Alden, a man she had once known, standing at the crossroads between suspicion and reluctant ally. A sigh escaped her lips as she traced the rim of her teacup, now grown cold. There was a time when she believed mysteries had clear-cut answers, when villains and heroes remained distinct, but experience had taught her that people were rarely one or the other. It was that very notion that unsettled her now. Could Victor be trusted, or was he merely another piece in this growing puzzle? Sentiment, she knew, had no place in this matter, no matter how much history whispered in the back of her mind. Outside, the village of Blackwood Hollow lay wrapped in silence, the mist curling through the narrow cobbled streets like unseen hands reaching for forgotten secrets. The gas lamps sputtered feebly against the weight of the autumn gloom, their light casting shifting shadows along the shuttered windows. Eleanor moved with quiet determination through the night, the damp air clinging to her coat as she approached the long-abandoned estate of Lydia Havisham, a house where whispers had lingered long after its last occupant had vanished, where tragedy and scandal had left a mark too deep to fade. The structure loomed dark and expectant before her, its once grand facade now hollow and vacant. But Eleanor knew better than to trust appearances. Secrets had a way of lingering in places others had long forgotten. She reached the wrought iron gate, her gloved hand resting lightly against the cold metal. The house stood as if watching her, its darkened windows betraying nothing. The burglary, the missing ledgers, the veiled warnings, there were too many loose threads, too many questions unanswered. And one in particular had been pressing on her mind ever since Victor's cryptic warning. Was something still hidden within these walls? Taking a breath, she pressed forward, the gate giving way with a muted creak. The garden had grown wild in the absence of its caretaker, the once pristine hedges now untamed, reclaiming the path. Eleanor's steps were careful as she approached the side entrance. She had studied Lydia well in their years of acquaintance, long enough to know the habits of a woman who trusted no one, and sure enough, beneath the third planter to the left of the door, her fingers brushed against cool brass. A key, a creature of habit indeed. With a soft click, the lock turned, and the door eased open. The house greeted her with silence, a silence so deep it felt almost expectant. The air carried the scent of aged paper, dust, and something faintly metallic. Eleanor pulled a small lantern from her handbag, its glow casting elongated shadows across the study. The room remained untouched, the massive oak desk standing firm, the shelves still lined with volumes that concealed more than just words. But it was the fireplace that held her attention. During her last visit, she had noted something, a discrepancy in the stonework, an unevenness that did not belong. Now, as she stepped closer, fingers brushing along the cold surface, she found it, a subtle ridge, a seam where none should exist. She pressed against the stone, her pulse steady. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low, grinding shift, a section of the wall moved, revealing a hidden compartment embedded within the hearth. Eleanor's breath remained measured as she examined it, an iron safe, old but sturdy, concealed within the very bones of the house. A slow, deliberate smile curved her lips. Secrets had a way of revealing themselves to those who knew where to look. From her handbag, she retrieved a slender hairpin, the unassuming tool that had proved useful more than once before. Carefully she ran her fingers along the dial of the lock, studying the worn edges, the minute scratches that told their own story. This was no mere storage box for old documents. No, whatever lay within had been hidden for a reason. And in Eleanor Whitmore's experience, reasons had a tendency to turn deadly. The air in the room felt tighter, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down upon her. Outside, the night stretched on, silent, watchful. Somewhere someone else was searching for these same answers. And if she had learned anything in her years of unraveling the truth, it was that in games like these, the first to strike was often the only one left standing. The rain drummed softly against the towering windows of Blackthorn Manor, a rhythmic whisper that barely masked the weight of the secrets hidden within its walls. Detective Eleanor Graves sat in the dim glow of her study, her fingers tracing the edges of an unsealed letter, its contents a labyrinth of cryptic references, dates, names, and a symbol she recognized but wished she hadn't: the Hollow Order, a society whispered about in the darkest corners of London, tied to disappearances, blackmail, and worse. Eleanor's breath was steady, but her pulse quickened as she pieced together the connections. Lord Edwin Ashcombe, missing for 6 weeks, had been investigating financial irregularities at his firm, funds siphoned, assets vanished. His last known letter hinted at a ledger, proof of something far-reaching, and now the letter before her, sent from an anonymous source, bore a single directive: find the ledger. Blackthorn hides more than shadows. The manor itself loomed beyond the study, its ivy-choked stone walls bearing the weight of centuries, its corridors lined with portraits, whose hollow eyes followed intruders with silent judgment. She had been here before weeks ago, when Ashcombe's wife first reported him missing, but she had overlooked something buried. Pulling her coat tight, she stepped into the storm, the night air thick with damp earth and tension. The manor's servants had long since retired, leaving only the occasional flicker of candlelight in the vast halls. Eleanor's steps were silent against the Persian rugs. As she moved toward the west wing, Ashcombe's private study, she pressed lightly against the mahogany door, unlocked. Strange, a chill ran through her. Inside, the scent of old paper and aged brandy lingered, but something was wrong. The bookshelves, once immaculately arranged, bore gaps where volumes had been removed. She ran a gloved hand along the polished wood, her fingers pausing over a faint indentation, a latch. With a gentle press, the panel gave way, revealing a narrow passage leading downward into the belly of the manor. A breath held, a decision made. torchlight illuminated the descent, the air growing colder with every step. Then at the bottom, a vault door, ornate, unmarked, but undeniably locked. Eleanor exhaled sharply. The Hollow Order was always careful, but she was more so. From her coat, she retrieved a small key, the one thing Ashcombe's wife had given her in whispered desperation. It slid in with a metallic scrape, the lock resisting, then surrendering. The door groaned open, revealing a chamber lined with filing cabinets, and in the center, an old wooden desk. On it, a single open ledger. Its pages, though yellowed, were inked with ruin, names of officials, accounts detailing bribes, and at the bottom, Ashcombe's name underlined in red. He had known, he had found this, and now he was gone. The realization struck like a blow, but she wasn't alone. A shift in the air, the faintest creak of leather behind her. Eleanor's fingers twitched toward the revolver at her hip, but a voice cut through the silence, a whisper, edged with malice. "You shouldn't have come, Miss Graves." The room, once merely cold, now bristled with danger. The trap had been set, and she had just stepped into it. Harriet Vale sat in the dim glow of her desk lamp, the golden light casting restless shadows over the aged oak surface. Before her, an intricate mosaic of papers, letters, and photographs lay carefully arranged, a web of deception slowly unraveling beneath her fingertips. She traced a name with her gloved finger, the ink faded yet unmistakable, Vincent Holloway, a name that had once held power in the world of finance, whispered in the corridors of influence, before vanishing without a trace. A decade ago, official records declared him dead. His fortune had dissipated, his assets seized, but the documents before her painted a different picture, one far more dangerous. Holloway had never disappeared, he had merely transformed, slipping into new identities, maneuvering through shell companies like a spectre, his wealth intact, and his reach more insidious than ever. Harriet leaned forward, her keen eyes skimming over financial transactions that wove a pattern of deception, offshore accounts, fraudulent land acquisitions, and discreet payments to men who had vanished under mysterious circumstances. This was no ordinary case of financial misconduct. This was something deeper, something rotten at its core, the Hollow Syndicate. The weight of her discovery pressed against her ribs, but she had no time to dwell on it. Reaching for the small camera beside her, she worked with quiet precision, capturing every incriminating detail. The soft clicks of the shutter filled the silence, sealing secrets in silver nitrate. Then she heard it. A sound so subtle it might have been dismissed by an untrained ear. A slow, deliberate creak beyond the study door. She wasn't alone. Harriet froze, her breath caught in her throat. She had taken precautions, worked under cover of night, yet somehow she had been found. Her mind sharpened, instincts honed from years of uncovering uncomfortable truths. If they were here, it meant they already suspected what she had found. But the question was, had they come to warn her or to silence her? With steady hands, she folded the documents into a leather satchel, ensuring that the most damning piece, a signed contract linking Holloway to a missing government official, was protected. She had one chance. If she hesitated, it was over. Silently, she moved to the window. The village below lay cloaked in thick fog, the gas lamps flickering in the distance. The note she had received earlier had been unsigned, its instructions simple: if you want the truth, come alone. The meeting was set for midnight. If she wanted answers, she had to move now. Slipping through the back entrance, she kept to the shadows, her path leading her to the abandoned ruins of Blackwood Mill. The structure had long since fallen into decay, its skeletal remains standing as a monument to forgotten industry. But tonight, it was something else. A meeting ground, a trap, or perhaps the final piece of the puzzle. As she approached, a figure emerged from the mist. A man tall, dressed in an immaculate coat, despite the ruin around him. He moved with deliberate precision, the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to control. Harriet's fingers brushed the revolver beneath her coat. "Miss Vale," he said smoothly, his voice steady. "I was hoping you'd come." Then from the darkness behind him, another figure stepped forward. A woman, Josephine Archer. The grieving widow of a once prominent judge, now a ghost in the city's underbelly. Her lips curved into something too practiced to be a smile. "You're meddling in things you don't understand," Josephine murmured, her voice almost kind. "But I'm here to offer you a choice." Harriet's pulse thrummed, but her voice remained unwavering. "I don't take offers from criminals." The man exhaled, almost amused. "Then you misunderstand the game we're playing." A gust of wind swept through the hollowed-out mill, rattling the rusted beams above them. Harriet stood unmoving. This was no longer about uncovering a conspiracy. This was war, and she had just stepped onto the battlefield. The fog clung to the narrow alleyways of Ashworth like a living thing, thick and deliberate, masking the truths hidden within its grasp. Harriet Vale stood motionless in the shadows, her breath controlled, her pulse steady, despite the weight of what she had just uncovered. The meeting inside the abandoned conservatory had ended, but two figures lingered in the half-light beyond the shattered glass walls. Evelyn Carrington and the man in the tailored coat, a figure whose presence had been a whisper in every corner of this case, but whose face had remained just out of reach until now. Harriet shifted slightly, positioning herself behind the remnants of an old trellis, her sharp gaze never leaving them. Evelyn's face was set in an expression not of fear, but of resolve, her gloved hands clenched at her sides as the man spoke in a voice that carried the practiced authority of someone who commanded, not just attention, but obedience. "We're out of time," he said, his tone precise, his patience thinning. "The magistrate already suspects. If he realizes what you've done—" Evelyn cut him off with a barely perceptible shake of her head. "He won't," she murmured, her voice steady, but Harriet caught the tremor beneath it. The man exhaled slowly, striking a match with the deliberate ease of a man who had lit 1,000 such flames before. The brief flare of light illuminated his face, strong features, eyes that betrayed nothing, a scar just beneath his jawline. As he lifted the cigarette to his lips, his voice lowered. "You were always a risk-taker, but this time, Evelyn, you're standing in a storm you can't control." Smoke curled between them, vanishing into the mist as she held his gaze. "I never intended to control it," she replied. "Only to survive it." Harriet's mind spun. She had followed Evelyn's trail, believing her to be another casualty in a game far larger than herself, a woman ensnared in something she couldn't escape. But this was something else entirely. Evelyn wasn't running, she was playing both sides. Was she dismantling the syndicate from within, or had she simply positioned herself to land on the winning side when the dust settled? The question churned in Harriet's mind as she adjusted her position, preparing to retreat, before she was spotted. But then, the name. A single name, spoken so softly she almost missed it. "Vasquez already suspects." The words were like a gunshot in the silence. Vasquez, the ghost. The man who never appeared in the light yet controlled everything within its reach. His name had been scribbled in coded ledgers, whispered in locked rooms, muttered in fear by men who had vanished before morning. And Evelyn was working against him, or with him. The truth hung between the words unspoken, just out of reach. Harriet didn't wait to hear more, she had what she needed. Slipping into the darkness, she moved with practiced ease through the silent streets, her mind already threading the pieces together. The rules of the game had changed. The question was no longer who was guilty, it was who would survive. The mist had begun to thin, revealing the first ghostly traces of dawn over the rooftops of Ashworth. Harriet stood on the edge of the river, watching as the slow-moving current carried away fallen leaves and forgotten sins alike. The town slept, unaware that somewhere in its midst the balance of power was shifting, the final moves being set in place. She had spent years hunting secrets, exposing lies, unraveling carefully constructed facades. But as the first streaks of daylight broke across the horizon, she found herself standing at a rare crossroads of uncertainty. For the first time, she wasn't sure which side she was on. The rain had softened into a fine mist, curling around the dimly lit streets of Blackwood Hollow like spectral fingers reaching for secrets buried beneath its cobblestones. Harriet Vale sat motionless in the corner booth of the Hollow Lantern, the oldest cafe in town, its rustic charm masking the hushed dealings that often took place in its secluded corners. Before her, trembling hands wrapped around a chipped porcelain cup, sat Samuel Hartley, the junior clerk from the magistrate's office. The very man who, whether he admitted it or not, had stumbled upon something that could shatter the delicate web of power that held the town in its grip. His gaze flickered around the cafe, wary of unseen eyes, before settling on Harriet, who regarded him with the quiet patience of a woman who had spent a lifetime unraveling tangled lies. "You said it wasn't about the break-in," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then, what is it about?" Harriet took her time answering, stirring her tea with slow, deliberate movements. "The break-in was never meant to steal anything," she said finally. "It was meant to reveal something, and I believe you already know what." Samuel swallowed hard, fingers tightening around his cup, as if he could draw strength from its warmth. Outside, the mist thickened, swallowing the street beyond the rain-speckled window, turning the gas lamps into little more than blurred halos of gold. "I don't know anything," he said too quickly. But Harriet caught the slight tremor in his voice, the way his foot tapped anxiously beneath the table. She leaned in, lowering her voice. "Samuel, I know about the missing ledger." His breath hitched, and for a moment she thought he might bolt. But then his shoulders sagged in resignation. "You don't understand," he murmured. "If I talk about this, it won't just be my job at risk." Harriet's lips curved ever so slightly. "You underestimate me. I already know what's at stake. What I need from you is confirmation." Silence stretched between them, heavy and thick. Then, in a voice so low it was barely audible, Samuel whispered, "The magistrate's files, they don't match. The records he has on Eleanor Wren, they've been altered." Harriet's pulse quickened. Eleanor Wren, a name that had surfaced too many times in the past weeks, a woman believed to be a missing link in the chain of Blackwood's oldest conspiracy. But why would someone go to such lengths to erase and rewrite her history? Samuel hesitated before adding, "It's not just her, there are others, names that shouldn't be missing, transactions that should never have taken place." And, he faltered, glancing toward the door. Harriet waited. "The midnight order," he finished at last, barely above a breath. The words sent a chill through her, colder than the mist outside. A name not spoken lightly, a name linked to men who thrived in the unseen spaces between law and crime, who controlled power from the shadows. If the break-in was designed to force hidden players into the light, then it had succeeded. But at what cost? Harriet reached into her coat, retrieving a small notebook, flipping it open to a list of names scrawled in ink. At the center was Eleanor Wren. Beneath it, a newly underlined entry, "The Midnight Order." She tapped the words lightly. "And where does Evelyn Carrington fit into all of this?" Samuel flinched as though "If she's involved," he said, "then she's playing a game far more dangerous than you think." Harriet studied him, weighing the sincerity in his eyes. Then she closed her notebook, tucking it away. The cafe door creaked open, a gust of cold air sweeping through the room as a lone figure stepped inside, rain-soaked and silent. Harriet didn't turn, didn't acknowledge them, but she felt it. The shift in the air, the knowledge that the walls had ears, and that the next move was no longer hers alone. The game had changed. The question was, who would make the first mistake? The wind howled through the narrow alleyways of Ravensbrook, carrying the scent of damp stone and something more elusive, secrets buried just beneath the surface. Inside the Copper Finch, a secluded tavern known for its discretion, Harriet Vale sat with an air of quiet patience. The low burning lanterns cast long shadows over the wooden beams, the flickering light revealing more than it concealed. Across from her, Inspector Aldous Graves leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming absently against the scarred wooden table. The third man at the table, Edwin Hargrove, looked far less composed. A junior clerk at the magistrate's office, he was pale, his fingers twisting anxiously in his lap. His gaze flickered to the tavern door every few moments, as if expecting it to swing open with the force of an unseen storm. Harriet had dealt with enough frightened men to recognize the signs. Edwin wasn't just nervous, he was terrified. You wouldn't have agreed to meet if you didn't already know how deep this goes, Harriet murmured, her voice soft but carrying the unmistakable weight of certainty. She tapped the edge of her teacup, watching him closely. So tell me, Edwin, who inside the ministry has been altering the records? The young man swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing as he struggled with an answer he already knew he could not take back. I can't, he stammered. You don't understand, Miss Vale. This isn't just about a few missing ledgers or forged documents. It's bigger than that. Harriet did not react, merely tilted her head slightly. I'm well aware, she said smoothly, which is why I need the name. Edwin hesitated, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. Graves, ever watchful, said nothing, allowing the silence to stretch, to suffocate. The tactic worked. Edwin's shoulders sagged, and he exhaled shakily, dropping his gaze to the table. Ambrose Whitmore, he finally whispered. Graves stiffened. Harriet felt her pulse quicken. The deputy undersecretary. Silence stretched between them, heavier now, more dangerous. Whitmore was no ordinary bureaucrat. His position allowed him to manipulate records, erase identities, and shield those who had everything to lose. If he was involved, then the rot within the system was deeper than Harriet had dared imagine. Edwin licked his lips, his fingers clenching into fists. He's not just covering for them, he continued, his voice barely above a breath. He's orchestrating everything, the bribes, the disappearances, even the accidents. His voice trembled on the last word. If he finds out I spoke to you, Harriet leaned in ever so slightly. He won't, she assured him, her voice steady. Not until it's too late. The words had barely left her lips when the tavern door creaked open. A gust of cold night air swept inside, carrying the scent of rain-soaked cobblestones. The lone figure who stepped through was draped in a heavy coat, its fabric glistening with moisture. They did not move toward the bar, did not exchange pleasantries with the patrons. Instead, they lingered near the entrance, eyes scanning the room. Harriet didn't turn, didn't need to. She could feel it, the shift in the air, the quiet pressure of being observed. We're out of time, Edwin murmured, his knuckles white against the tabletop. No. Harriet's mind was already working, already piecing together the next move. The game had changed. She set down her teacup, the soft clink echoing in the charged silence. Then, she said, voice calm, it's time we make the next move count. The heavy silence of Blackwood Hall was broken only by the distant toll of the midnight bell, a sound swallowed almost instantly by the thick velvet drapes that lined the crumbling estate's grand chamber. The air inside was damp with the scent of aged leather and secrets, the dying embers in the great stone hearth casting restless shadows over the assembled figures. 12 men, each more accustomed to wielding power from behind gilded desks, now sat rigid and uncertain, their gazes darting between one another, suspicion twisting the edges of their carefully cultivated masks. At the head of the table sat Reginald Devereux, the reclusive financier whose wealth had built half the city, but whose dealings had remained as obscured as the fog that clung to the Thames. Beside him, Victor Aldane, a former colonel, his bearing still sharp, but his eyes betraying an unease he could not mask. James Whitlow, the merchant whose silent investments in the black market had made him untouchable, adjusted his gold-rimmed spectacles as if to steady himself. And yet it was not these men who held the true weight of the room's tension. It was the woman standing apart from them, her presence a calculated disruption to their world. Eleanor Graves. The emerald silk of her dress shimmered in the flickering light, but it was her gaze that held the true fire. Cold, unrelenting, unwavering. She had played this game from the periphery for too long, threading whispers through the corridors of power, feeding just enough truth into the right ears while keeping her true intentions buried beneath layers of deception. But tonight, there was no veil, no misdirection left to hide behind. A slow breath. Then she spoke. "We are all here," she said, her voice smooth but laced with something unspoken, something final. "Because the game has reached its final move." A rustle of discomfort passed through the gathering. Whitlow exchanged a glance with Devereux, but neither dared speak first. They had played their parts well, or so they believed, but Eleanor knew better, knew that fear, no matter how carefully concealed, always found its way into a man's hands. A twitch of the fingers, a clench of the jaw, the faintest shift of posture, and then the doors swung open. A single figure stepped inside, his black coat damp from the relentless London drizzle. He moved with the practiced ease of a man who had never feared the law, only the consequences of underestimating it. Silas Vaughan, the last and most dangerous piece of the puzzle. He was not a businessman nor a politician, but a man who thrived in the spaces between legality and crime, an architect of illicit fortunes and lost reputations. His presence was both a confirmation and a warning. Devereux straightened in his chair. "You assured us discretion, Miss Graves." Eleanor tilted her head. "I assured you control." A flicker of amusement danced in Silas's eyes as he strode forward, unbuttoning his coat. "And yet here we are," he murmured, his voice carrying the weight of a predator who had just found himself in unfamiliar terrain. A room full of men who once dictated the course of empires, now awaiting instruction like schoolboys summoned to the headmaster's office. A faint chuckle, a shift of discomfort. Eleanor allowed the moment to settle before she continued, her words measured. "Tonight we end the uncertainty. The documents are in my possession. Every forged transaction, every silent bribe, every betrayal carefully inked onto paper. Evidence that would not just ruin reputations, but dismantle entire dynasties." Silence, heavy, suffocating. Victor Aldane's jaw tightened. "If you think blackmail will buy your safety." "Oh, Colonel." Eleanor's smile did not reach her eyes. "I am far past safety. This is not a negotiation. It's a reckoning." The final word sent an almost imperceptible shiver through the room. Silas exhaled slowly, his gaze lingering on her just long enough for understanding to pass between them. And then he laughed, a low, knowing sound. "So that's it then," he murmured. "The final trap." Eleanor lifted her chin. "Yes." A pause, a moment stretched tight. Then, the distant sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the halls of Blackwood. Heavy, measured, inevitable. The doors were about to open again, and this time, no one inside would leave untouched. The chandeliers in the old manor cast a dim, wavering glow, their light hanging like a blade over the tense gathering. The night's darkness clung to the walls, wrapping itself around the grand but decaying structure, as though history itself was awakening from a long slumber. Around a large, polished oak table sat a group of individuals, men who were always hidden behind closed doors, their power felt but never seen. And yet, tonight they were here in the open, bound together by something far more dangerous than mere association. The air was thick with unspoken dread, every flickering shadow stretching like unseen fingers reaching for the truth. At the head of the table, Lord Harrington pressed his palms together, his aristocratic mask of composure betraying the faintest tremor. Beside him, Major Blackwood's sharp military gaze scanned the room, missing nothing, reading every shift in breath, every flick of a glance. Banker William Graves dabbed at his perspiring brow with a handkerchief, his usual confidence dissolving with each passing second. Further down, two art dealers, Victor Renard and Sebastian Lowe, whispered in hushed tones, their words so faint even the ancient walls of the manor could not catch them. But the figure that drew the most attention stood apart from the rest. Adeline Sinclair, her sapphire dress shimmered under the flickering chandelier, her posture poised, yet her eyes betrayed a deeper story. There was a storm behind them, something unreadable, something dangerous. She was not merely a guest in this dangerous game, she had become its unwilling centerpiece. The tension thickened as the heavy oak doors creaked open. The air seemed to still as a shadow stepped into the room, moving with an eerie grace. He was dressed impeccably, his tailored suit so dark it seemed to drink in the light. Every thread, every stitch, spoke of a man who commanded attention without ever demanding it. He stepped forward, his gaze sweeping the room like a general inspecting his troops. A slow, knowing smile curved his lips. "So we have all gathered here to play the final hand." His voice cut through the silence, smooth yet weighted with something far more lethal than mere words. Adeline met his gaze, and in that instant, the unspoken war between hunter and hunted was declared. "We were told we were here to resolve a situation," Lord Harrington murmured, though his tone carried the unmistakable edge of unease. "No," the newcomer corrected, his voice soft but unyielding, "you are here because this situation has already spiraled beyond your control." The chandeliers flickered again, their glow dimming, as if the very manor itself sensed the coming reckoning. The air grew heavier, the walls seeming to inch closer, bearing witness to the inevitable. Adeline finally moved, stepping toward the table, with deliberate calm. She placed a small leather-bound notebook on its polished surface. The silence stretched, taut as a wire about to snap. The heavy storm lashed against the grand estate, rain slithering down the towering windows like silent witnesses to the unfolding reckoning. Inside the dimly lit chamber, a circle of figures sat around a polished mahogany table, their reflections distorted in its gleaming surface. The fire in the hearth crackled, its embers throwing shadows across the ornate walls, but the warmth did nothing to thaw the creeping chill of anticipation. Every breath was measured, every gaze calculated, because tonight there was no room for mistakes. At the head of the table sat Lord Everett Sinclair, his regal composure faltering beneath the weight of unspoken accusations. Beside him, Jasper Langley, the military man whose strict discipline could not hide the thin sheen of perspiration on his temple. William Aldridge, the banker, clutched his whiskey glass with white-knuckled desperation, while the two art dealers, Lucien Devereux and Samuel Mercer, exchanged fleeting glances, their practiced confidence eroding with every second. Yet, amidst them all, she was the one who commanded the room. Eleanor Whitmore stepped forward, her entrance marked not by theatrics but by the sheer force of her presence. The soft click of her sensible heels against the marble floor was the only sound as she approached the table, her gloved fingers brushing over the smooth leather of the small notebook she carried. She placed it down with quiet finality, her expression betraying not a shred of hesitation. "Shall we begin?" she murmured, her voice as soft as silk, yet laced with something that sent a ripple of unease through the room. For a long moment, silence reigned. Then, with the precision of a blade slicing through fabric, she turned her gaze toward the two art dealers. "Gentlemen," she mused, tilting her head ever so slightly, "I imagine you are intimately familiar with the concept of provenance." Lucian's smirk faltered, while Samuel swallowed hard. Eleanor's smile never wavered. "That is the beauty of a carefully woven lie, is it not?" she continued. "Legitimacy only becomes necessary when questions are raised, and conveniently, those questions were never asked, until now." A flicker of motion, subtle but not unnoticed. Across the table, Damien Voss shifted slightly in his seat, the corners of his lips curling into an unreadable smirk. Eleanor's gaze found him at last, her expression betraying no emotion. "And then of course we come to you," she said, her tone as light as ever, but laced with steel, a beat of silence. Voss inclined his head slightly. "Do continue, madam." She did not hesitate. You are the thread that ties it all together. A name rarely written, yet always present. A collector, a financier, a masterful orchestrator. Her fingers grazed the notebook. You were there in the Aldridge affair, just as you were in the Lancaster scandal before it. Your network is vast, your methods elegant. Find the desperate, the greedy, the careless, and let them do the work for you. A slow, measured breath escaped Voss's lips, as though he were mildly entertained. A rather poetic summation. A factual one, Eleanor corrected. And then, with deliberate care, she reached into her handbag and retrieved a small cream-colored envelope. She set it down in the center of the table, her fingers brushing against its edges before withdrawing. Inside this envelope is a letter, a rather detailed account from someone who grew rather tired of being manipulated. A former associate, if you will. The effect was immediate. Jasper's jaw tightened. Sinclair's fingers twitched. Aldridge paled, and for the first time that evening, the flicker of something truly dangerous crossed Voss's face, so fleeting it was nearly imperceptible. Eleanor tilted her head. Voss's fingers stilled against the armrest of his chair. She studied him for a long moment, then smiled. A small, pleasant smile, the kind that had sent many a guilty soul into a spiral of doubt. She patted the notebook lightly. Shall we continue? The storm outside roared louder, rain hammering against the glass, thunder rolling in the distance like an unseen beast stirring in the dark. One by one, the players unraveled. With quiet precision, Eleanor dismantled every carefully constructed alibi, every fragile deception. She forced them to confront their own complicity, some as architects of the crime, others as mere cowards who had chosen to look away. By the end, Sinclair's poise had crumbled. Jasper had abandoned his denials. Aldridge was trembling, and yet Voss remained the enigma. Even as the final pieces of the puzzle slotted into place, he sat with an air of detached amusement, his expression unreadable. And that, Eleanor thought, was the most telling detail of all, because men like Damien Voss never gambled without an escape plan. She glanced at Adeline Everett, the woman who had played a dangerous game of shadows alongside her. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in Adeline's eyes. Eleanor folded her hands, the weight of inevitability settling over the room. The unmasking was complete, but the final game had yet to be played. A hush had settled over the moonlit estate, its grand halls echoing with the weight of secrets too heavy to bear. Eleanor Whitmore stood by the frosted window, her fingers resting lightly on the velvet curtain, her breath forming a delicate mist against the glass. The manor had always been a fortress of wealth and whispers, but tonight it felt like a gilded cage. Below in the dimly lit drawing room, the guests moved like phantoms, each carrying a burden they dared not name. Lord Ashcombe, the venerable patriarch, sat in his customary chair, his eyes glinting with something darker than mere suspicion. Across from him, the ever-cautious Sebastian Hargrove twirled his silver signet ring, his nerves betraying his otherwise impeccable composure. At the grand piano, Lydia Fairchild let her fingers dance over the keys, the melancholic tune a quiet lament for what had yet to unfold. The letter had arrived precisely at midnight, slipped under the library door with no trace of its sender. Its contents, written in an elegant but unfamiliar hand, had sent a shiver through the household. The truth is in the walls. Look where the past was buried, and you will find the beginning of the end. Eleanor had known in that moment that the game had begun. She turned her gaze toward the long corridor leading to the east wing, where the doors had remained locked for years. No one spoke of what lay beyond them, not since the incident, not since the night of the fire. Yet something told her that the answer lay within those forsaken rooms, waiting to be unearthed. A sharp creak in the floorboards shattered the quiet, drawing everyone's attention to the doorway. There stood Vincent Hale, the enigmatic investigator, whose presence had been both anticipated and feared. He held a single candle, its flame casting eerie shadows across his angular features. "Shall we begin?" His voice was low, almost amused, as if he already knew the answers they sought. The room tensed. It was not the question itself that unsettled them, it was the certainty that by dawn, one of them would not leave this house unscathed. And so, as the storm raged outside, as the fire in the hearth crackled like a living thing, Eleanor took a breath and stepped forward. Whatever lay hidden in the past would no longer remain buried. The walls were whispering, and tonight they would finally be heard. The clock in the grand hall struck midnight, its chime swallowed by the oppressive hush that settled over the Whittaker estate. A storm had gathered beyond the towering windows, the wind howling like a chorus of lost souls, rattling the ancient glass as though demanding entry. Eleanor Vance stood poised at the edge of the drawing room, her fingers trailing over the polished mahogany of the grand piano, the notes of an unfinished melody lingering in the air, like ghosts. Around her, the assembled figures exuded a collective unease. Lord Harrington adjusted his cuffs with unnecessary precision, his usual confidence fraying at the edges. Margaret Devereux, her gloved fingers clasped tightly, cast quick glances toward the towering bookcases, as if seeking answers among their gilded spines. Edgar Price, the financier, tapped a steady rhythm against his crystal tumbler, the whiskey within sloshing slightly with each anxious motion. At the heart of it all, standing with his back to the marble fireplace, was Victor Langley, a man whose carefully curated charm never quite masked the predator beneath. Eleanor had spent years untangling deceptions, but tonight was different. Tonight she was not merely an observer, she was the architect of a reckoning. The letter had arrived at precisely 11, slipped beneath the heavy oak door of the study, a single page elegantly penned in ink as dark as the secrets they all carried. "The past is not as buried as you hoped. The truth waits where the echoes still linger." A riddle perhaps, but Eleanor had long since mastered the language of hidden truths. Her gaze flickered toward the hallway, toward the locked door at the end of the east wing, the place where, a decade ago, everything had begun. The weight of 1,000 unspoken confessions hung in the air as she stepped forward, her voice carrying an undeniable gravity. "Shall we begin?" The wind shrieked through the chimney as if protesting the inevitability of what was to come. Eleanor reached into her satchel and withdrew a bundle of papers, each meticulously gathered, each containing the threads of a conspiracy woven so seamlessly it had eluded justice for years. "Deception," she began, placing the documents on the coffee table with deliberate precision, "is an art form, is it not? A well-spun lie, much like an exquisite tapestry, can withstand scrutiny, until of course one pulls at the right thread." A flicker of movement, Langley's fingers tightening around the armrest of his chair, subtle, but telling. Eleanor continued, her eyes locking onto each suspect in turn. "Lord Harrington, your investments were carefully chosen, art, antiquities, businesses teetering on the brink of collapse. And yet the numbers never quite matched, did they? The funds always found their way elsewhere, redirected before the ink had even dried." Harrington stiffened but said nothing. "Margaret," Eleanor turned her attention to the elegant widow, "your late husband's estate suffered rather peculiar losses, did it not? Unaccounted assets, misplaced documents, but it was never about the inheritance, was it? No, the true crime lay in what you helped conceal." Margaret's expression remained carefully neutral, but her fingers trembled against the folds of her gown. Eleanor's voice grew sharper. "And Edgar Price, the banker, the trusted handler of wealth, you ensured the numbers remained obscured, the ledgers misaligned just enough to go unnoticed by all but the most discerning eyes. A master of misdirection." Edgar swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. Eleanor allowed the silence to stretch, the storm outside punctuating the moment with a low growl of thunder. Then finally, she turned to Langley. "And you," she murmured, "the puppeteer, the one who kept the machine running so effortlessly, your charm, your influence, your carefully cultivated network of associates, all designed to ensure that the truth remained buried. A slow smirk crept across Langley's face. "A compelling narrative, my dear," he said, his voice smooth as ever. "But speculation is not evidence." Eleanor tilted her head slightly, her fingers brushing the edge of the papers she had brought. "No," she agreed, "but these are." She gestured toward the study doors, and at that moment they swung open. Standing in the dim corridor, flanked by two uniformed officers, was Detective Inspector Graves. His presence sent a visible ripple through the room. Langley's smirk faltered. Edgar Price's glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the marble floor. "I would suggest," Graves said calmly, "that none of you make this any more difficult than it needs to be." The weight of realization settled over the assembled guests. The game was over. The storm outside reached a crescendo as Eleanor watched, unmoving, as the officers stepped forward, their footsteps echoing like the tolling of a bell, and as Victor Langley rose slowly to his feet, his facade finally cracking, Eleanor allowed herself a single breath of satisfaction. The past, after all, could only remain buried for so long. For a long moment, Catherine Alden said nothing, her silhouette framed against the dim glow of the gaslight outside the narrow window. Then finally, she exhaled, the breath carrying the weight of 100 untold truths. "So you knew." Across the small study, Inspector Marianne Ellis regarded her with quiet certainty. "I suspected," she admitted, "but I needed confirmation." A wry, bitter chuckle slipped from Catherine's lips, though there was no amusement in her eyes. Only exhaustion, and a quiet sort of triumph, the kind that carried the sting of sacrifice. "And now you have it." Marianne tilted her head, watching her carefully. "You never intended to escape, did you?" A pause, then a slow shake of the head. "No," Catherine said, her voice steady, but laced with something heavier. "I intended to destroy them." A storm raged beyond the city, the wind clawing at the rooftops, pressing against the window panes as if urging its way inside. Marianne did not move. "You weren't just a pawn," she murmured. "You played your own game." Catherine turned away, her fingers brushing the edge of the desk, tracing invisible lines across the polished wood. "And I played it well." The words hung between them, brittle as old parchment. Then finally she asked, "What happens now?" Marianne studied her for a long moment before answering, her voice unreadable. "That," she said, "depends entirely on you." As the clock on the mantel struck the hour, the storm began to wane, its fury receding into the distance. The case was closed, the guilty had been unmasked, and yet, deep in the quiet corners of Marianne's mind, a single thought lingered. In the grandest games of deception, the most dangerous players are always the ones you never see coming. 2 days later, the high stone walls of Briarwood Courthouse loomed over a gathering crowd, its iron gates standing firm against the restless movement of those who had come to witness justice unfold. The magistrate's gavel struck once, twice, an echo of finality in the vast echoing chamber. Within the dock, the accused sat in rigid silence. Nathaniel Whitmore, once the epitome of untouchable wealth, now a man unraveling beneath the crushing weight of his own deception, his finely tailored suit, unable to mask the sheen of sweat on his brow. To his right, Eleanor Stratton, the widow with blood-stained hands, her expression unreadable as the charges were read aloud, her delicate fingers clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. And beside her, Simon Graves, the disgraced officer, the protector turned conspirator, his jaw locked, his gaze fixed on some invisible point beyond the courtroom's marble pillars. He did not speak, he did not need to. His silence had already betrayed him. Marianne sat in the gallery, her hands folded, listening as the layers of their crimes were laid bare. The ledger entries, the falsified records, the hidden transactions that tied them all together, a web so carefully woven, yet so easily undone. Their empire had thrived on secrecy, but all it had taken was one loose thread, one whisper in the dark, and now as the gavel struck for the final time, the illusion collapsed. Outside, the rain had ceased, leaving the city bathed in a dull, washed-out glow. Marianne found Catherine at the edge of the courthouse steps, her hands tucked into the folds of her coat, watching as the last of the condemned were led away. She did not turn as Marianne approached. "This is how it ends," she murmured. Marianne stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. "It ends the way it was always meant to." Catherine let out a quiet laugh, a sound caught somewhere between relief and regret. "And how was that exactly?" Marianne studied her carefully. "That," she said, "is entirely dependent on you." For the first time, Catherine turned, her gaze sharp, something unreadable flickering beneath the surface. "I played my part, didn't I?" Marianne inclined her head. "Yes, but the question remains, was it for justice?" A long silence. Then at last Catherine whispered, "Does it matter?" Marianne held her gaze. "It matters to you." The clock tower chimed in the distance. For a brief moment the world held its breath. Then, with a final glance toward the fading storm, Catherine turned and walked away, disappearing into the mist of the city streets. Marianne did not stop her. Some truths were not meant to be pursued. Some mysteries were never meant to be solved. The storm had passed, yet the echoes of its fury still lingered in the damp air, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them like an unbroken thread. Evelyn Thorne stood by the window, her fingers ghosting over the glass, tracing patterns in the condensation as if searching for something lost. "Unreadable?" she murmured, her voice a whisper of something brittle, something already broken. "No, you wanted to be the one holding the pieces." Inspector Genevieve Harrow regarded her with an expression unreadable in itself, her sharp gaze softened only by a sliver of something that might have been understanding. "And yet here I am," she said simply. For a moment neither of them spoke, the silence thick with the weight of all that had transpired, of the choices made and the truths laid bare. Then, at last, Evelyn turned her gaze outward, staring beyond the walls of the dimly lit parlor into the vast nothingness of the morning mist. Genevieve adjusted her gloves, the movement practiced, deliberate. "Goodbye, Evelyn." She did not wait for an answer as she stepped through the door and into the quiet. The fate of Evelyn Thorne would not be decided by courts or laws, but by the burden of what she had done, by the prison she had built around herself long before this night. And perhaps that was the justice she had sought all along. The gardens of Ravenswood Manor shimmered in the pale light of dawn, the heavy dew clinging to the leaves like a final remnant of the night's secrets. Inspector Harrow sat upon the weathered stone bench beneath the sprawling oak tree, a small plate of shortbread biscuits resting beside her, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She had seen many endings in her time, some righteous, some tragic, and others so mired in moral ambiguity that the lines between guilt and innocence blurred beyond recognition. This, she thought, was one of the latter. The guilty had been exposed, and yet there was no true victory in peeling back the layers of human frailty. She thought of Evelyn standing motionless at that window, forever caught between past and present. She thought of Sergeant Ridley, a man once bound by duty, now undone by the very ambition that had driven him. She thought of Victor Langley, a man who had walked away yet again untouched by justice, his influence coiling through the ruins of the conspiracy like a serpent waiting to strike. And she thought of justice itself, not as an absolute, but as a fragile shifting thing, shaped by those who held the scales in their hands. With a quiet sigh she reached for a biscuit, taking a small deliberate bite, the taste of butter and sugar lingering on her tongue. There would always be another deception, another tangle of lies waiting to be unraveled. And she, an old detective in a world that refused to be as simple as it once seemed, would be there to unravel them all. The village of Ravenswood had always carried a certain charm, its winding streets and ivy-covered cottages untouched by the relentless march of time. And yet in recent weeks it had been the stage for secrets, for betrayals, for reckonings that had sent ripples through its quiet existence. But today, the sun spilled golden light across the rolling fields, the scent of fresh bread wafted through the air, and the sounds of a world moving forward filled the cobbled streets. For the first time in a long while, there was no puzzle to untangle, no dark truth clawing at the edges of Genevieve's thoughts. She sat in her favorite chair, positioned just beneath the wide bay window, where the morning light cast a warm glow upon her delicate porcelain tea set. Outside, the world continued on, gardeners tending to their roses, shopkeepers preparing for the afternoon rush, neighbors exchanging pleasantries as if the darkness had never touched them. And perhaps for them, it hadn't. A soft knock at the door interrupted her musings. Setting down her cup of Earl Grey, she called out, "Come in." To her mild surprise, Inspector Marcus Holloway stepped inside, removing his hat with a polite nod. "You look rather content," he observed. Genevieve allowed herself a small knowing smile, for now, because mysteries never truly ended. They merely waited, lurking in the quiet, in the choices people made, in the secrets they thought buried. And those, she supposed, would never truly be solved. Inspector Holloway observed her, his sharp eyes betraying the amusement beneath his otherwise gruff demeanor. "Inspector Harrow," he remarked, folding his arms as he leaned against the doorway, "I expected to find you knee-deep in another enigma by now." Genevieve Harrow merely smiled, the edges of her expression touched with a quiet knowing. "Even a detective must allow herself a moment of peace, Inspector," she replied, gesturing toward the delicate porcelain teapot before her. "Would you care for some tea?" Holloway chuckled, stepping inside with the ease of familiarity. "If it means I won't find myself chasing down another fugitive in the middle of my cup, then gladly." He settled into the chair across from her, his keen gaze sweeping the room, as if expecting some cryptic clue to be hidden among the lace curtains or tucked beneath the floral cushions. "You did quite the job unraveling that mess," he admitted at last, the respect in his voice unmistakable. "And if I may say so, you looked quite satisfied watching Ridley and Langley being led away." Genevieve stirred her tea with an almost meditative slowness, the clinking of the spoon against porcelain the only sound between them for a moment. "Justice is a rather rewarding thing, don't you think, Inspector?" she mused. Holloway smirked, tilting his head slightly. "That it is," he agreed. "Though I do wonder what will you do now that the streets of Ravenswood are free of villains." Genevieve's eyes gleamed with something unreadable, something almost mischievous. "Oh, Inspector," she murmured, setting her cup down with a quiet clink. "There will always be another mystery," Holloway chuckled, shaking his head. "And I dare say you'll find it before I do." Later that afternoon, as the grandfather clock in the hall chimed 2, a letter arrived at Harrow's doorstep. The handwriting was familiar, elegant, composed, yet with a boldness that had always been Evelyn Thorne's signature. She unfolded it carefully, her sharp gaze scanning the words with an unreadable expression. "Dearest Genevieve, I do not know what the future holds, but I have decided to face it on my own terms. I will not disappear into obscurity, nor will I allow the past to dictate the sum of who I am. There are places in this world where a woman of sharp wit and a second chance might still forge a future worth having. I suspect you knew that already. I will not say goodbye, as I have no doubt our paths will cross again. But until then, know that I am forever grateful, not just for your mind, but for your patience, for your willingness to see me as neither villain nor victim, but as something far more complicated. Yours as ever, E.T." Genevieve folded the letter neatly, placing it atop the small wooden box where she kept only the most significant of correspondences. A small smile played at the corners of her lips. Some endings, she knew, did not have to be tragedies. As dusk settled over Ravenswood, the village exhaled, returning to the quiet rhythms of life. The scent of rain-kissed roses drifted through the evening air as Genevieve took a slow stroll through the garden, pausing to run her fingers along the delicate petals of the flowers she had planted in the spring. Life, it seemed, had found its way back to normal. Mrs. Holloway was once again gossiping over the garden hedge. Young Peter Sinclair had finally mustered the courage to propose to Eleanor from the bookshop, and the constable's dog, Jasper, had resumed his rightful place by the bakery, waiting patiently for the occasional pastry thrown his way. And yet as Genevieve breathed in the fragrant summer air, she knew that peace, however welcome, was always fleeting. Somewhere in the shifting shadows of the world, another puzzle waited to be solved, and she of course would be ready.